Hey guys, we're back to continue our work on this friend. So Nagash, we've been working on him like sequentially. We've been doing his sword up until this point. The next thing to do is to work on his staff. So the staff of power is this wonderful thing that he's got over here. Features a lot of bone areas, and in the past, I think I've been looking for a reason to show off why it's important to vary the bone colors in use on a model. And today, I finally have the opportunity. We've got Nagash's hand over here, and this is going to be a bone color. And likewise, his staff features lots of little skeleton faces, which is adorable, absolutely. But yeah, there is a need to differentiate the two different colors of bone. So for Nagash's skin, his bone areas, what I'm going to be using is a combination of Gryphcharger Grey and Skeleton Horde to create a desaturated bone color, which I think sort of befits his ancient status. Now, for the more recent looking bone, I suppose, on his staff, those ones would just be straight up Skeleton Horde. And that gives us a balance between a sort of desaturated bluish kind of undead flesh or bone tone. No, that's going to be weird to say. And something that's a little bit more towards cream, that looks a little bit more like a stylized depiction of bone rather than something that looks sort of like decayed and broken down in the case of his exposed sections of bone. So that's what it's looking like so far over here on his hand. There we go. And then also, I think I'm going to be applying it. I'm wondering about this area, this big skull. Probably a bit of variation never hurt anyone. So let's use that over here. And we're going to leave off working on the rest of him for now because I want to really concentrate on this stuff to get it to where I like it to be. So if this, if it takes us a few sessions to get through working on Nagash, then so be it, because you know what, Nagash deserves it. One of my favorite models from the 80s, well, 90s, and one of those Gary Morley sculpts that really gets kind of a lot of hate for being, the over-designed mess that it is with strained proportions. But it has a special place in my heart nonetheless. So the funny thing about his hand is it's not entirely bony, right? It's kind of like fleshy in certain points. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm leaning towards using a flesh skin tone or a bone tone that is a little bit more fresh, a little bit less decayed actually, or depending on how you look at it, it could be read as more wizened and more ancient. Either way, it looks different from the way I'm choosing to do most of the bone areas on his staff, and I think that will serve us in good stead to help us visually separate the two parts when we look at the model. I think that's an important distinction to make. I think very often, if the model contains a lot of bone surfaces or comprises a lot of bone surfaces, the tendency is to want to paint them all the same to keep them consistent, right? But I think for our purposes today, differentiating these two areas or these two major sections of the model, kind of crucial, kind of helps us to separate them visually and to understand that they're not the same material. So yeah, and I think adding like a few additional colors on this model will not go amiss. Today, what I've done is I've put up all the colors that I'll be using, or most of them, as far as I can guess, onto the wet palette ahead of me. So right now, I'm using Skeleton Horde for the flesh tone, as mentioned. I'm just gonna call it flesh tone because I'm not sure what else to call it. Bone tone sounds dubious. It's just Gryphcharger Grey together with a bit of Skeleton Horde, as mentioned, 50-50. And then I've set out the usual Vallejo silver for and my gold wash. Check out the description for details on how that is mixed up. In the comment section below, in the detail section below. And yeah, nothing new here, I suppose. Just good old fashioned painting. So how's everybody doing today? I hope you guys are doing good. It's really warm out today in Singapore, so everyone's staying indoors as usual. Humidity is, at an all-time high despite the direct heat. So it's kind of put me in the mind of Camry, really. Yeah, no, Singapore's not that warm. I jest, but yeah, there are times when it does feel like, you get a little bit of a sense of what it's like to live on the shifting sands of Camry under the Warhammer sun. Okay, so we continue to apply a little bit more of this ashy grey bone color onto the skull on the back. It always amazes me how these early models were sculpted 1:1, using putty, right, instead of using digital sculpting techniques. The idea that you would sculpt this on both sides, front and back, and you needed to make them both look identical, that kind of always blew my mind. His little bird friend over here, this bizarre creature, a weird little chimera made of bone on his face, as well as what is essentially mostly a bat, I suppose. This bone bat bird, kind of bizarre creature over here. Kind of cute, really. Could be a familiar, could be just part of his staff. It's hard to say. But yeah, really quite an entertaining part of the model to paint. Lots of weird little details on these early miniatures. Like they're not readily identifiable sometimes. Like you need to kind of look at it and have a bit of a think about what you're trying to represent over here before you decide to paint it as a piece of metal or as something more organic, or maybe a mix of both. Certainly a lot of these models had the details painted in a fairly colorful style, in order to make them look a little bit more alive rather than just what their constituent materials might be. You would imagine this stuff is probably made up of a lot of wood and metal. Instead, we're going in to assume that they've been decorated nicely. Cool. So we're also going to come in and do a little bit of work on the bottom of that staff. Trying to work out what color that should be. I imagine probably let's go for Guilliman fur, sorry. Nice red-brown kind of mahogany tone. Maybe tan a little bit more towards that reddish end of the spectrum. So let's pop a little bit of that down here. We don't need too much, it's just this little wooden section at the bottom. And I'm working on this now because at least it's out of the way and not likely to make a mess when I overlap the wet paint with something else. So yeah, I've decided to spare you all the effort of unscrewing all my paint caps and opening them one by one to drop them onto the palette. So this way, hopefully we get through this a little bit more efficiently, and the videos get to be a little bit shorter as a result, a little bit punchier, not quite so painful to sit through. So let's move on. And of course, along the way, I will introduce the paints that I'm actually using, just to let you know exactly what colors will be on the menu, as usual. Okay, cool. Now, I think the skull over here, the smaller one that I've kind of left out, yeah, I'm gonna do it in black. It's always nice to have a mix of tones on these models, just to differentiate the details to make sure everything stands out nicely. So let's work on that little skull, and then that top area. For most of the black areas, I won't be using straight up Black Templar. I think for most of these, what I've done is I've decided to use a combination of Pterodon, Turquoise, and Black Templar. So let's go ahead and mix that in now. This puddle below is Pterodon Turquoise, and you sort of see why in a minute, because when we apply it over our bird friend, we get quite a pleasant, deep turquoise color. Something that has the richness of black, but not really that sort of monochromatic hue, which I think is quite pleasant. So we're going to go right ahead and brush it up next to the bone, being careful not to overlap any of those areas. And as you can see, it's quite an interesting looking color. Go on to his back, his two little weird feet. I have no idea what this creature is supposed to be. I mean, visually it looks like a carrion, but which is a unit type from Warhammer Army's 4th edition for undead as well. Back then, Karen used to be weird undead creatures fused together from prehistoric birds. Like I would imagine they were vaguely like pterosaur looking or Archaeopteryx looking. And then these would then be stuck together with grotesque magics. And then they actually used to have a rider, a funny little soul-sucking spirit that would ride on its back. And really a weird idea. But basically they were a combination of skull face and bird body. And I imagine this is a micro version of that. Either that or this is his personal, equivalent of a mobile phone, I suppose. Maybe this is what he would use to communicate back to the Black Pyramid. Send messages to his stewards and so on. Nagash is a busy man. Kind of like the CEO of a little undead empire when you think about it. And I guess that's one of those elements that really made the undead or evil factions in general really interesting in Warhammer for me. Just the fact that the format of Warhammer armies, where you had to go into detail about each of the different factions a little bit more, kind of made it necessary for the writers to delve a little bit into how undead or or evil races, I guess, their societies operated. And one of the things that I found really amusing about Nagash in general was that, well, he's Supreme Lord of the Undead, right? So most of his handiwork, I suppose, most of his servants were undead or some description or other. And he actually had quite a large network of undead servants, including all of his Mortarchs. At the time, the only Mortarch mentioned was Arkan the Black, who was his Lich Lord, and I think he was his Vizier, his closest minion, really. And at that point, in the 4th edition Warhammer Armies book, Nagash had lost control of most of his more senior members of his court. So Neferata had already gone on to do her own thing. Later, she would return as Silver Spire, the vampire queen of Silver Spire. I think that's the name of it. Silver Tower, Silver Spire. Silver Tower is a Zinj thing, isn't it? And Manfred's off doing his jaunts in the old world, so he's busy. Abharash has kind of gone to become to lead his monk existence as the head of the Order of the Blood Dragons. So, well, Nagash is kind of on his own, really. But he's not bored. No Lord of the Undead is truly bored, I guess. And he's got his plans for world domination, which include the whole idea of turning the Warhammer world into a place of stasis by removing the sort of threat and corruption of chaos. So one thing that made Nagash really interesting was that he had a genuine solution to the problem of chaos, insofar as in a world that's corrupted or tainted by the threat of chaos. Really, I think he pieced together the idea that only living creatures are susceptible, and therefore remove the living creatures, remove the life, as it were, turn it into an eternal realm of undeath, and you've kind of solved the problem of chaos, isn't it? Because, the dead things don't mutate anymore, and the dead things are an eternally efficient and self-renewing source of, manpower, as it were. And in that sense, you would have achieved total order and total control, which is terrible for everyone who's alive, of course, who doesn't want to be separated from their life force or to be subservient to the will of somebody else. But at the same time, Nagash did find a solution for the curse of chaos, so to speak. And in that sense, he was more successful in this regard than almost anybody else. Convincing everybody that this was a good plan? Yeah, that's an issue. But he did have at least the only genuine other solution to the tainting powers of chaos. Of course, this sets him up in interesting opposition to everyone in the Empire who didn't want to become undead. Anyone in every other civilization, from the High Elves to the Dwarves to the Orcs and Goblins and so on. Anybody who didn't want to be dead would have a problem. That is just how things are, I suppose. With great vision comes great opposition, it turns out. And yeah, unfortunately, never quite got off the ground. Because it's not long after this that the first assassination attempts were organized. Nagash actually eventually goes down in battle numerous times. He also goes down to subterfuge to King Alcadazar, who was set up by the Skaven, another evil faction that didn't agree with his plans for world domination, unfortunately, and who set up an assassin from within the Black Pyramid of Nagash. So Nagash had King Alcadazar, who was one of his chief rivals in Camry, in one of his dungeons, and the Skaven infiltrated an assassin into the Black Pyramid, armed Alcadazar with basically the Fell Blade, which was a warpstone encrusted blade. And we know from our previous video that Nagash actually relied very heavily on the use of warpstone to boost his powers. So I guess in the same way that, Superman's homeworld is made of kryptonite, and therefore he's got a vulnerability to it. In a similar way, Nagash became susceptible to the very same material that gave him a lot of his powers. So Alcadazar managed to sort out Nagash while he was still recovering from casting his great magical spell. There we go. So he's looking pretty good, I think. And just looking at how I want to fill in these two areas, more than likely a bit of gold will not go amiss. So let's do his bangle or bracelet over here. Now, the more I paint these extremities of Nagash, the more I'm really tempted to get in and work on that purple for his outfit. But yeah, I think I have to be a little bit patient and wait for that. On the subject of purple, wondering whether I want to do it in purple at all, to be perfectly honest. I think Nagash is a model that can look good in many colors. Any of the dark, sort of more mysterious looking colors, deep red, deep purple, maybe even black, blue, all of these colors. Purple is traditional though, so I might end up going down that same route eventually if some other brainwave doesn't hit me. Let me know what you think. Let me know what color you think might be good for Nagash. I think he can work in many color schemes. It's just a question of whether or not I want to go really traditional. And to be fair, I've already departed from the norm by injecting a lot more green into the color scheme. Originally, I think a lot of these model parts would have been done in red, as was the fashion of the day. Back in the day, it seems that many parts of these models, if the painter didn't really have an idea as to what color to make them, they would just do them in red. And to be fair, it would look good in photos, right? It would be kind of bright and appealing. So yeah, why not, right? I do like the green for him though, and as I mentioned earlier, it kind of ties back to the story, the importance of warpstone in his life, or unlife as the case may be. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a little bit more Gryphcharger Grey because I've mixed all of my Gryphcharger Grey into the bone color for his hand. So let's grab a little bit more Gryphcharger Grey. That's this stuff over here, and let's start to think about blocking in this area here. So this is a tiny stylized Black Pyramid of Nagash. Sort of a little depiction of his home base. It's kind of cool. It's kind of like the idea of the US president having a little White House with him on his iconography wherever he goes. Kind of cute. And a little bit more around here as well. As well as around the head and legs. There we go. So a little bit of color, a little bit lighter than Bird Boy above. But yeah, just to keep things a little bit interesting. And then we're just going to come in and clean up a bit around the silver areas. And I'm looking forward to dropping the gold as usual. Always a great point painting a model when I drop in the gold wash, because often the silver is so bright and eye-catching that it kind of looks weird until I drop in the color that I actually intend for it. Cool. So we can come in and we can cut in around this flame motif that I've done as warpstone flames. In the original, I think it was done in red, which I found slightly odd. Not really to my taste, hence green is the color of the day. Plus, as I mentioned before, warpstone is a big part. So yeah, that story gets reinforced in my choice of colors over here. Now, just to the south of the section that I'm painting is his headdress. So I think that will be the next section that I'll tackle in a separate video. He's got such an interesting headdress, right? Like this clown head is one of the most polarizing things ever in the whole Warhammer setting. There are lots of little bits and pieces that we'll go into regarding the head, but suffice to say, that's not his hat, his original hat. Somebody else has his hat. And I think you know who it is. Also, this was the head that was basically the resculpted version, right? After Gary Morley got his feedback and was told to make the head more ostentatious. So this was not Gary's first choice of head by any means. It is a little bit ostentatious and over the top, and it was kind of sculpted as a joke, really, because it does look like a giant party hat. But like it or not, this is the version that made it to the final through QC, and this is the head that was released to the public. And like I mentioned, in the period immediately following his release, and for quite some time afterwards, the model actually got pretty good coverage from the company. It used to be quite proud of this model until it stopped being proud of it because people were making fun of it. And I can sort of see why people made fun of it. It's a slightly silly looking model overall, but you know, I think Gary Morley gets far too much stick for this, because I struggle to imagine what any sculptor would have done if they were given the brief to produce a giant skeleton dude, you know, with, you know, just giant equipment to match. There's nothing quite like it, right? Because if you sculpt a giant, I think one of the nice things about sculpting a giant is that you get to make little references to its scale relative to other things. So for example, you could have him bedecked in makeshift armor, and makeshift armor would be more than likely a bunch of shields or similar, you know, human scale bits and bobs. And this would sort of reinforce nicely the size of the model, such that it looks like a large model, even without any other relying on the model standing next to it. But Nagash always had this problem, right? Because Nagash, he's a gigantic character model, so creating a gigantic ostentatious model, you know, with the very best magical gear and so on, was always going to be a challenge. And it wasn't until recently that, you know, the more updated version of Nagash came out. And to be perfectly honest, while that model has, you know, a lot more updated textures and details, I'm not a huge fan of it, mostly because of nostalgia. I like this model for what it is, for what was being, you know, created at the time. And yes, there are many flaws, there are many things that, you know, probably a modern sculptor would do differently. But the concept of a gigantic undead skeleton is kind of silly anyway. So I have no issues with the way Gary Morley chose to do this in the end, at a time when, you know, sculptors will be laboring under time constraints to get things done, and rather a complex brief. I feel it's a difficult one to get just right, and his interpretation, in my opinion, is as valid as almost anybody else's. More valid, in fact, because, well, he was the one laboring under the pressure of quality control and so on. So long story short, I kind of like the way this model turned out in the end. It's certainly iconic. It might not be your definition of perfection, but then perfection's so subjective anyway. Did this model create a splash? Yes, it did. Did it look good in pictures? Standing in front of legions of equally comical looking undead? Absolutely. Did young me want it? Oh, 100%. I thought this model was the bomb. Just as I mentioned in a previous video where I painted the sword, the way I interpreted the rules back then didn't leave me a lot of options to actually pursue using the model regularly, unfortunately, because I was a little bit too rigid to consider the use of special characters a thing. So I never really got around to owning the model, and that's what we are rectifying with these videos, I suppose. The chance to actually paint these models, because they are really enjoyable to paint. The details are nice and large, for example. You get to really sort of see all the little bits and bobs, and there's a clarity of detail on this model that's unparalleled on others, and it's quite pleasurable to paint because, as you can see, I'm really flying through the details right now at this point. I'm dropping in a few highlights on his hand. This is just the previous skeleton horde plus Gryphcharger gray mix, and I've mixed in a bit of white, just pure white, nothing too simple, to get some initial highlights, sketch out some values, some highs and lows. Whatever I don't paint will be low, whatever I paint on with this color will be high, and then I can decide how I want to take it in the next direction. In the original model, I think whoever painted this piece, I don't think it was Mike McVeigh, but whoever painted it, well, it could have been actually, now that I think about it, because there are some parts of freehand on this model that are very Mike McVeigh. But yeah, so this model originally had little veins painted on the hands and on the sort of flesh bits, the bone bits. They were okay, except that they look really odd because veins on skeletal hands just kind of didn't really work for me conceptually. But I guess with a little bit of care, that could be made to look good. So slipping on a little bit more skeleton horde around the edge just to define the area. And I'm going to go right in and paint his ring. So as mentioned, we're going to be going magic item by magic item on this guy, up until the point that we're happy with the extremities, and then we can come in and finish the main body and bulk of him, which happens to be primarily covered with another magic item, which is the black armor of Nagash, his single most costly piece of equipment. But today the focus is the Staff of Power, and the Staff of Power is, well, it's really straightforward, right? Because as mentioned in the previous video, really costly wizards struggle to maintain their effectiveness in games of Warhammer of this era, because all wizards would be affected by the power levels of the winds of magic. So this was a variable roll that you made at the start of every turn to determine how much magical power was actually available to all spellcasters. And unfortunately, this meant that it doesn't matter how powerful you are as a spellcaster, what level you were, if you were given no resources to work with because of a low roll on that random amount, well, then you would be becalmed like a ship without wind to fill your sails. So unfortunately, you kind of sit there looking a bit strange and impotent. But not so for Nagash, because the Staff of Power was great. What they allowed him to do was to store up to 4 magic cards in it. And this means that he could keep a store of power from turn to turn. In addition, it began the game with 1 power card already stored in. 1 card that wasn't total power or drain magic. So he could hold one magic card already within his staff, and he could hold a grand total of 4 at his maximum. So Nagash really had a way to not be becalmed. And of course, it really allowed him to store up power to have one truly apocalyptic turn of magic when it kind of benefited his side most. He could unleash all of it at once and hopefully make a huge hole in the enemy. And that was really his kind of like splash value would really make a big difference to how impactful Nagash could be on the battlefield. And he needed to be, right? Because he was like 700 points with all his magic items. Without his magic items, he was already 475. And that's a hefty, hefty investment for any army. There have been games I've seen where basically the Winds of Magic did not allow any spell casting at all because of bad rolls. And you just couldn't have that if your character was going to cost this many points. It would be a little bit sad. A little bit sad indeed. So I'm putting on some paints onto this ring. This ring doesn't really have an in-game effect, but it kind of looks cool. Kind of makes him look pimp. And then we're going to go in and we're going to highlight Bird Friend. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we added Pterodon turquoise into the black to give it a little bit more of an interesting color scheme. Now, when you add white into it, the effect is magnified. And I find this is where the payoff is particularly effective. So drawing a series of vertical lines on these striated wings. To emphasize them and to guide the eyes up the sweep above. And then a few little dots and dashes on his chest to symbolize the fur. And his cute little legs. And a little bit more on the back as well. Yeah, so like I said, it always amazes me how the sculptors could more or less replicate these front and back. Maybe it's a lot easier than I think, I don't know. I always used to wonder which the sculptor did first, the front or the back. I did dabble in sculpting a little bit when I was younger and I really enjoyed it, but it was really tedious work, especially for detailed bits like this. But the advantage of doing sculpting by hand, I suppose, is that these areas always felt paintable by hand. A lot of the newer models, which are computer sculpted, digitally sculpted, feel like they can't be painted by hand because, frankly, a lot of them were done at a larger scale and then reduced. So the whole painting process felt a little bit different. Not so models of this era because these were clearly done at a 1:1 scale by a human being. Therefore, felt a lot more manageable to me, and they still do. Which is not to say that newer models don't have like amazing detail. If anything, the detail for modern models is even more impressive. It's just, yeah, it doesn't really seem all doable. That dialogue between the painter and the sculptor feels like the sculptor cheated a little bit. And you feel like less of a part of it. Feels more top down, I guess, as a result. It's less of an exchange between two artists, and it feels more like an interaction between an artist, you, the painter, and a corporation. But I guess that's just how things are. In many ways. So, a little bit of green goes a long way to making the staff look a lot more interesting. And we can go on to highlight some of these areas around the structure of this staff as well. If your highlights come out a bit stark, as they are now, in my opinion, I'll probably come back in and I will wash them with a little bit more of the original Pterodon and Black Templar mix. It's just a case of letting it dry fully and then coming in to adjust it, cutting into the highlight if needed, if the highlight is too large and too bold, or too coarse and too fat. Run a little bit around the edge here. And you find that these, because of the specific geometry of the sculpting for parts like this, there's a tendency to make the edge stand proud from the model, just because these were hand sculpted, I suppose. So there was a lot of excess compensation when sculpting. Instead of drawing a perfect box that doesn't protrude at all, a lot of these actually protruded at the edge, and the edges were more pronounced. Therefore, highlighting them on the edges seems a little bit easier, seems a little bit more pleasurable to me. But of course, your mileage will vary. At some point, I think we will paint a few more modern models, simply because I don't, there are modern models that emulate some of the characteristics I enjoy from these earlier models. Not many, I must admit, but there are a few that have really gotten my notice. And yeah, in particular, I really like the Blood Bowl models, the Blood Bowl figures for that game. Plus, the Blood Bowl game is great, right? Personally, I like it. And a lot of the models that have been released for Blood Bowl I find particularly enjoyable to paint. Perhaps because they don't have weird weapons and so on. So you just can focus on the glorious armor as well as the details like the hands and so on. Very enjoyable indeed. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, being able to store magic cards within this staff really gave Nagash a bit of an edge against other spellcasters. It meant that he was never really magically becalmed should you roll badly on the Winds of Magic. And that allowed him to continue to be dangerous. Of course, undead. The undead style of magic was particularly benefited by the fact that it always had something meaningful to do, even in turns where the enemy was far away. So it wasn't just a constant bombardment, right? Undead magic was a lot about generating passive power, about storing up, about building up your undead units with additional soldiers, so bolstering your forces before they met the enemy. And Nagash, because of his abilities and because of this stuff, could get his undead hordes to truly epic size before ever he met the enemy. So this was a useful ability. Not that I ever got to try it, but yeah, in principle, you could sort of see how how useful the stuff would be in practice. And of course, the other alternative would be to store up magic for offensive magic. Because the way this game worked, magically, you had to overwhelm your opponent's defenses in order to get a spell through. So just having a deeper pool of power to attack from simply meant that you could wear out your opponent's defenses systematically and then save a few cards to launch that final killing spell. And that worked really well to great effect in many games in White Dwarf Battle Reports at the time, making Nagash a really exciting piece to watch on the tabletop, because something exciting was always happening with Nagash. You could count on him to have a great influence on the table no matter what happened. Although, to be fair, he didn't appear in very many battle reports simply because, well, he's Nagash. He's kind of a big deal. So I'm dropping in a little bit of white mixed with Gryphcharger Grey for these stones on his pyramid, just to articulate these little details a little bit more, make them a little bit readable from afar. And then after that, to finish off, I think we'll be coming in to highlight that black skull in the center. Black pyramid, black skull, or white pyramid, black skull, as the case may be. That's basically how I chose to go for it. So a little bit of color gets worked into this. And I think getting used to painting models of this era means getting used to highlighting a lot of skulls, right? Because these models are just absolutely bedecked in skulls. The Chaos models get a lot more silly, of course, with the number of skulls, but even on this guy, I guess he is an undead model, so I guess the use of skulls is pretty appropriate. Yeah, you do have to do quite a lot of these. So, fingernails, as befits a lot of the undead, he's got his nails done, very pretty, and then the ring on his finger. Let's block in the white first, and then let's go in with probably green to match his sword and match his staff top. It's important to always have the same few colors emphasized. If they're important to your color scheme, you should probably find ways to repeat them on the model so that you can get a bit of a theme going. And if that color means something to the backstory of your character, you get bonus points for that, in my opinion. Okay. We clean up his skull again a little bit more on his staff, because I think I was a little overzealous with the wash when I came in to clean up the highlights just now. This is the painter's dance, as I've said many times. That back and forth as you come in to ensure the details are nice and readable. Okay, now I think I want to grab a bit of red or orange, as the case may be. Let's do orange. Okay, so this is Vallejo Clear Orange. Great color for this, for highlighting red in general. And to this, spread it out slightly, and you can come in and drop a little bit of detail onto this. This is really a series of tiny skulls, of course, because everything is on this model. I guess that's one of the reasons why this model got so much stick. To be honest, yeah, the details are kind of hilarious once you get past the initial visual impact of that much stuff going on the surface of these models, of this model. If you look closely at the staff, actually some of the skulls are upside down as well. So they're all kind of having a really good time on the surface of this weapon. Yeah, it really was an iconic piece from that period. Painted in an iconic way, and definitely taking pride of place in many a battle report. So yeah, quite hard to imagine any discussion of the greatest miniatures of that period without talking about Nagash, because holy crap, giant skeleton boy is giant. Okay, so we're going to come back in to finish off the ebony parts of his staff. That's what I'm calling it for these areas. I've decided that instead of cutting back these highlights, we should lean into them a little bit more. Put a little bit more emphasis on the edges, because I like the way it's brightening up the staff overall. Sometimes you have to make executive decisions like this when the model looks like it's tending towards becoming a little bit too dark. You need to come in and decide, okay, cool, do I cut back the highlights to make them neater and smaller? Or do I just lean into it and try to brighten up the overall piece? In this case, I think a little bit more of a highlight brings out more of the structure of the piece, which helps make it look a lot more readable and a lot more attractive as a result from a distance. So there you have it. A little bit more for his skull. Well, this skull, there are many skulls. And then that weird kind of alien mouth. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it is an alien. Conspiracy theory. I mean, at this point, Nagash is so heavily mutated by his use of warpstone that he's practically not human anymore. So by definition, he would be an alien. Oh no, that's not true, because he's actually from the Warhammer world. So yeah, but he's about as alien as you can get without actually being from another planet. Okay, we are coming to a point where I'm happy to just leave it as is. We can move on to the other parts of the model. I'm dying to paint the purple robes. I think after giving it lots of thought, it has to be purple robes because it's just iconic. Maybe I'll add other colors to make it a little bit more interesting, but I think this is a good place to leave it. Just a final bit around his ring, final bit of green around his ring, and the joy of contrast paint is that we can just put this on, let it kind of sit, and I think we're just about good to go. A little bit more orange mixed with a bit of white, just to lift it up a little bit. Put that on the nail of his thumb and the other fingernails as well. And I think he's really starting to look pretty good. A bit more gold around the gold. And to define the decrepit flesh areas a little bit more, cut in to some of the highlights that we have that were admittedly a little bit harsh. And I believe Nagash is looking pretty good. Yeah, when you add the extra shading on his knuckles, or rather in between his knuckles, it really defines the shape of his hand pretty well. And the back of his hand with those weird veins. Weird. A bit more line work on the stones. Of his mini pyramid. I was kind of thought that this looked a little bit like one of those like little souvenirs that you could get from visiting like the pyramids, the actual pyramids in Egypt. Tiny little sculptures that you could buy at souvenir shops. Yeah, there we go. So I am pleased with this. I think the stuff looks pretty nifty. Perhaps the last thing I'll do is to add a little bit of a highlight to his staff, the wood at the bottom, because it's looking a little bit bland right now. Some fine wood grain would go a long way to making this pop. But we are rapidly approaching a point at which I'm happy to move on to the next section. Quite happy with the look of this. And we can continue to address probably his headpiece, his headdress, his hat, his Skelly Pope hat. Oh, Nagash goes on to be called the Skelly Pope a lot. Because look at the guy. There is a minor Skelly Pope, which is Arkan the Black, who at this time is mounted on his chariot, his odd flying chariot. And then there is the true Skelly Pope, that is Nagash himself. Because who else would be a better candidate for that title? Okay, so this is Nagash Staff of Power. Pretty happy with the way that turned out. As before, when we go into unifying the overall model, we will spend a little bit of time refining this guy, but for now I think it's in a good place for us to move on. Okay guys, have a good one. Hope you enjoyed watching this. Bye bye.